Thank you. I will try to get everyone excited by being slightly provocative on the topic of COVID and the digital response so far to the COVID crisis. Um, I want to talk actually about a second wave that already happened without anyone really noticing, that happened around March, April, very soon actually after the first one. And that second wave was around a form of technological solutionism in the way we should approach digitally the pandemic. So there was essentially a second epidemic, an epidemic that was layered on top of the original one, and that was around the idea that we should start doing Bluetooth-based digital contact tracing. So for those of you who don't know, most of the apps that are, if not all of them actually, that are deployed in Europe right now are based on Bluetooth, completely unproven technology for distance ranging, for estimating distance. And they have a ton of problems that I will get into in a second. So I think it's really important to look back and to think back at what happened over the past 6 months in relation to that digital response. Partly so that we don't replicate mistakes in the past. We're able to change strategy if we decide it's needed. And also for the audience that is more technical here, we can anticipate and maybe start building alternatives because at some point we might need them. So the way I see things as they happened back in March and April is that a lot of war leaders were looking at what happened in Asia, and they started to have some kind of cargo cult envy to what was happening in the digital space in Asia. So cargo cults are these cults that emerged mostly in the Second World War in Oceania, when locals started observing that whenever the white man would do a certain set of gestures, then suddenly cargo would arrive with a lot of very sophisticated and beneficial goods in them. A lot of technology that the locals had never seen and that were so useful to them and so magical to them. So what they started to do is to observe the white man and start to try to do the same thing. So they built like mock airstrips, they built radios out of coconuts, they tried to do all of the same things. They didn't necessarily know why they were doing it, but they were hoping that this would lead to cargo arriving and suddenly everything would be magical for them. And I would argue that the Western world did some kind of reverse cargo cult with the East, with Asia, in relation to those contact tracing apps. So part of the problem is that those apps are now built in understanding that we had in March and April of what Asian countries were doing in relation to a disease that was still very new. So a lot of it has evolved since then. The most relevant things that happened after that understanding was crystallized in March and April in the Western world was that there had to be trade-offs. And this is very relevant to this audience. You're trying to do contact tracing, you're trying to do exposure notification, you're trying to communicate information between different actors about who was in contact with whom. So there is going to be privacy risks associated to that. It's inescapable. It's core of what you're trying to do actually is to reveal information about others. And so suddenly you had a lot of security researchers that started to discuss how you should design a protocol, you should design systems that just a couple months ago would have been completely unthinkable. Some of the protocols, and actually the main protocol, is about essentially tagging consistently with identifiers those who are infected so that others can trace themselves in relation to those. So I can guarantee you that no security researcher would have suggested to deploy such an insecure system just months before. But their thinking has evolved, at least some of them, justified by emergency. And it has been presented to the general public as a safe and good balance in relation to the risk and the potential utility. So this is very relevant in terms of privacy and the collective interest and understanding the relationship between an individual's data and the public interest. But Almost none of those solutions that are deployed right now are focused on actually providing useful features to citizens. They're just about notifying them that too bad, you lost at the COVID game and you have a risk of being infected. But it's an after the fact notification. It's not really providing useful information on the moment, which is hindering adoption. Now, what is less prevalent in the public discourse, but I think very prevalent on the technical side, is that this is actively prevented by Google and Apple. So Google and Apple have built a system, a platform that enables countries to build apps on top. And this platform comes with limitations that are justified based on privacy concerns. So should our governments, is the understanding of governments evolving in relation to privacy? Yes, because of the COVID crisis, yes. Is the understanding of platforms evolving? I would say not so much, or at least not publicly. But it's not that surprising in the end. I mean, smartphones are built, are ultimately the wrong platform to do peer-to-peer contact tracing. In a sense, or at least platforms when they are smartphones when they are captured by business interest, because they are derived from an individualistic or capitalistic view of this tool, which is ultimately one of the most individual-centric tool you can ever imagine that has ever been built. So I mentioned that the scientific understanding of the epidemic was evolving. This is really important. This is really important in designing new responses independently of smartphones and applications. It's very important to understand strategies that should be deployed, but also in constructing solutions. So I'll try to explain it very quickly here. One of the defining features of SARS-CoV is its over-dispersion. It's the fact that if you look on average at the number of secondary cases that an index case will infect, yes, on average, without other interventions, you are around 2.5. That's the average. But the over-dispersion is very large. What does that mean? That means that there is actually a high variability around this average of 2.5. So a lot of people actually infect 0 secondary cases. Around 80% of the index cases, the primary cases, infect no one. So another way to explain this, or to draw a consequence of this, is that the best predictor of risk is not anchored in an individual, but it's actually anchored in an exposure event, and particularly in the source of the events. If you know that 2 exposure events are tied to the same source, then the outcome, whether that person is infected or not, is highly dependent. It will be correlated if it's the same source. And so that changes your whole perspective, because the core element becomes not just about an individual, but about a pair of individuals that were in contact with each other. And that means the systems are much more complicated to design, potentially, if you don't think about it the right way. But at the same time, one can adopt strategies that adapt to this situation. And one can start asking, okay, well, fine, but I'm trying to fight an epidemic, and I'm trying to find those exposure events where suddenly there is a lot of dispersion. I might not find all of them, but I should certainly try to find those that occur for many people at once. And that changes the type of tracing that you will start to do. Instead of doing prospective tracing, like most countries are currently doing, where you're trying to find, if you have your index case, you're trying to find other people that this index case might have infected. It means that you should go actually up the chain, trying to find where that infected person has been infected. Because you know that if you do that, then you are likely to find a lot more infected people much more quickly and more easily. And that explains a shift that is happening now in solutions, a shift towards QR codes and venue-based tracing of infections. Switzerland, which was one of the countries that has been pushing for Swiss COVID and the Google Apple exposure notification framework, is itself changing canton per canton its strategy towards QR code tracing. In a sense, from a technological standpoint or a privacy standpoint, things are simpler because they become individual again. They become less social now because you can start tracing the individual, or can build tools that help tracing the individual in relation to places or events rather than tracing them in relation to each other, which from a privacy standpoint would be very complex. So in a sense, it becomes simpler because the risk is attached to a place rather than an encounter or someone else. So to summarize the main changes that I see that COVID has brought in the discussion around privacy and public interest, now the issue of personal data is clearly understood as being in the public interest. Just back in January, I was going in Geneva, where I live here, to UN discussions, trying to make those points and just encountering uncountable obstacles to make it to help to explain to people there who were thinking at a global scale that empowering individuals with their personal data was extremely important. The people in Geneva think about, global warming, pandemics, all of those things. But now that we've lived something like this, the perspective has definitely changed. Another big change is that now governments understand.
Paul,
Yes.
can I ask you to close within like 30 seconds?
Okay, so another big change is that governments now understand the unacceptable power of Google and Apple in this ecosystem. And there is one last thing, a certain wish that I have, that another realization that should come is that a lot of the data we need actually already exists, and the GDPR should enable us to get to it through the portability requirement. The portability not to build businesses, but to serve the public interest. And no one has pushed for that argument yet. Sorry for being a bit over time.